So a while ago we promised ourselves, in fact, that we would treat ourselves to some alcohol-free beer from the shop here in Shrewsbury.
What a treat.
Called Dry by Choice. What a treat. Well, it is during the working day. You know,
it is,
you
yeah.
be careful.
Well, yeah.
And you raised the point. What does that mean in our employee handbook? Is this allowed?
So is it like drinking a can of Coke? Is this the new Coke? Coke Zero or Pepsi, depending.
Well, like in the early days when you couldn't smoke places, but people took vaping and e-cigarettes. Yeah, it's not cigarettes. So is that the same? I could have a beer at my desk, could I?
It's
So
kind
anyway,
of
here
random,
we
isn't
are.
it?
Yeah.
It's a random thought.
Yeah. Sit there instead of having your Coke.
Yeah.
I'm having a Guinness. So we've got a little selection here. I went down and I spoke to Mike in the shop, and he gave me this little array of high variety. So for our next few podcasts, we're going to maybe have one per podcast, if we can limit ourselves. To only one. So I thought maybe the Guinness Naught today, because that's what started the conversation, because we raised it in the Six Nations.
That's a heavy drink.
Well, is it though?
Is it? I don't know.
I don't know. So we're going to try this one?
You can try that one, yeah.
All right. I'm going to pour this, and we'll see what we think. I'm going to put this near the microphone.
Oh, there we go. We'll just spray it all
over
over
the microphone with
Excellent.
some Guinness Zero. I heard the little widget inside do its thing. You always do this as well like that.
And if viewers are wondering why I have a wry grin on my face at the moment, it's because I have just started a little controversy on a WhatsApp group just before I started this podcast around did we or did we not land on the moon? Talking about Elon Musk's SpaceX space ship exploding yesterday, and
it wasn't an explosion. It
I can't remember what the phrase was now.
It was what was it? An unscheduled disassembly or something.
Something like that, yeah.
Random unscheduled disassembly or something.
So yeah, there was a few comments around. I just love it. There's a few comments around like, well, we managed to get to the moon without things breaking with NASA and all that, and all you have to say is, or did we? ..
And then
exit the chat.
Anyway, cheers.
Come back. Cheers. Guinness.
Do you know what it tastes like?
Tastes like Guinness.
Tastes like Guinness. That's brilliant, isn't it?
I don't think I've had an actual Guinness probably for about 15 years. So,
but it brought all the memories from that. Well, I'm a bit more of a regular Guinness drinker, once or twice a year.
That does taste like Guinness.
Guinness. There we go. So that's my new version of a Coke at the desk. I'll wake one up. All right. Well, before the 0% goes to our head, maybe we better start a podcast. Hello and welcome to the SME Growth Podcast produced by Wellmeadow here in Shrewsbury. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about something that's come out recently on the Roger Martin-Fagg reports, the economic reports that we publish. So here to talk with me about that is Richard. Hi, Rich.
Hello.
And I'm Dave Parry. So we're going to talk about productivity, the country's productivity puzzle. That's something to get everybody out of bed in the morning, isn't it?
Whoa, yeah.
Talk about that one. And we thought about, because we publish the Roger Martin-Fagg reports every quarter. They get in quite well, don't they?
They do go down very well. People seem to enjoy them, but we've never really spoken about them on the podcast before.
We never have.
We probably touched on some of the areas that Roger sort of brings out of all of the economic data.
Well, I did do some summaries of the reports as well for a while, but I think this is probably a better way of using the thoughts that triggers. So it goes. So this subject would appeal, I think, to most of our listeners, definitely in the SME world.
Yeah.
How does productivity at a national level impact us, and what can we do about it at a company level?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we're going in it from.
So I'll probably start by defining what productivity is.
Yeah, productivity. So there's a lot. I think it's worth noting this is not an economics lecture. And if we even tried, exactly, and if we even tried, we would get ourselves into a lot of hot water, I think, because we're not economists. But we do know that productivity is kind of output over input. It's the output you get for every hour worked at its simplest level. But it's not quite as simple as that, because there are other measures of productivity which include non-labor elements, so machines and capitals and stuff. So total factor productivity. And it's also worth noting that each country's got its own method of measuring it. So you could get a bit tied up in knots trying to compare, but the government tries to do this thing. So that's what it is. It's output per hour worked. And wouldn't it be great if that was a high number, because then we're all going to be paid more and all that sort of stuff. That's the idea.
I did read something about this today. There was a big boom in productivity. It's mostly American focused. The book I was reading, but which post-capitalism. I can't remember who wrote it, but it was quite an interesting summary of how productivity improved post World War II up until about the 1970s, and how that drove consumer growth, because as wages increased, people could afford more consumer goods, and then how that reached a kind of tipping point in the 70s, and we haven't seen real wages increase since then. And that's about as much as I can remember without straying into territory.
Yeah, well, that's also tied into increasing globalization, of course, because and Roger talks about this when he came to talk to us last year. We've increased the available labour pool with the ability to ship goods reasonably cheaply, until recently anyway, but normally from all the way from China, and it can displace workers here, so that keeps wages down, whereas in the past that would have crept wages up. So I think there's if you look back at productivity, it used to be not bad. It's not as if it's been forever a problem. There was a phrase used 20, 30 years ago about Britain being the sick man of Europe and all that. But up until the crash in sort of 2008 or so, productivity was sort of going okay. About 2% a year growth or something. It's not stellar, but, it's not bad compared to other countries. But then it kind of fell off a cliff. The wheels fell off in around about 2008, 2009. And
is that because of the financial crash, or is there some other reason for that?
Well, there are a lot of reasons which we'll come on to that hold productivity back, which were certainly true before the financial crash. But if in any part of this sentiment plays a role, then that's what's definitely changed since that. And I do wonder as well if there's a momentum to these things. If you just get used to investing or improving your ways, and then there's that big sudden stop and everybody gets scared. Even in our clients now, people talk very differently about borrowing money from the banks.
Yeah.
They never used to. You just assumed that if you need some money, you go to the bank and borrow it.
Yeah.
But suddenly, because the banks changed their behaviour around the crash and then suddenly wouldn't lend to people that previously they would have done, everybody's starting to think a bit differently about it.
I suppose that plays into some of what, Roger's a behavioural economist, isn't he? And that's a lot of what he talks about when we have him come and speak, when he get him once a year in Shrewsbury, or if you ever hear him somewhere else. He talks about the kind of, the way that people act and how that influences the economy.
Yeah, the behavioural bit. You can't predict it with just the numbers like the economists try to do. Yeah. So where are we at now? We're not the worst. Japan's a lot worse than us, both in growth and absolute numbers. They've had a really tough time, decades of stagnation. But in terms of the leading competing economies, you might like to think we were keeping up with. We're worse than Germany, France and America. Slightly better than Canada, apparently. But Germany, 10% behind. France, 18% behind. And depending how you measure it, the US, something in the 20s, 23, 25% behind. So
what drives that? Is it? So France have higher wages, don't they? So that's drives a bit more automation, is it? Is that?
Well, there is an argument that both the high wages but also the social laws making it very difficult to dismiss people in France means that you're less likely to take them on in the first place, and therefore you have an easier case to make for investing in, certainly if we're talking about machines replacing humans type of productivity. Now, that isn't all of it, as we're going to come on to, but where that takes part, that's going to have an impact. In America, they're doing quite a lot at the moment in a new act they brought in this year called the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's encouraging a lot of investment into the US from other countries. It's not affecting UK quite as much because we have a sort of quasi-trusted trading partner status, but a lot of companies are relocating to the US to bring in more domestic supply, and that's bringing productivity up.
Is there a cultural element here as well? Because we tend to, there's a lot of office chat, isn't there, in the UK? People come in, there's kind of a social element to being at work, which perhaps isn't there in other cultures, maybe. Yeah,
and that probably plays out at both ends of the day. I think you're right. And Roger was going on about this, wasn't he, in one of his recent reports. He talked about the fact that we tend to come to work in the UK and we have a bit of a coffee machine chat and catch up. And did you see the footy last night? And then gradually settle into work. And the perception is, although whether there's data to back this up, I don't know, that in other harder working countries, if we're to call them that in inverted commas, then you come to work and you're at your desk, and by 9 o'clock you're at
Do
it.
your work. Yeah.
But then there's also a culture in maybe those countries where they'll leave quite promptly as well.
Yeah.
4:30, 5 o'clock, out the door. Big focus on home life. Whereas in the UK, it's not uncommon, especially for small businesses and business owners, to be working much later than they should be.
Yeah.
And weekends as well, and good as well. So yeah, definitely a cultural element to it. So anyway, there we go. We've got a problem. There is a thing, and it's well documented that we have a productivity puzzle, and no one has yet managed to work out a solution. So if you listen to this podcast, it will all be solved.
So by the end of 30 minutes' time,
yeah, we will have cracked
the riddle will be.
So there are lots of reasons talked about. There's several, though, that relate to SME world. So if you're running a business or working in a small business, you will relate to some of these. And whilst there's a long list of potential reasons, there's probably 4 big ones that I think it's worth us expanding on in terms of what impacts it and what could we do about it. So one is skills, the availability of skills and the level of high skills where you need them, for sure. The general infrastructure of the country, which is everything from roads and broadband and there's a trigger here.
Don't get me started.
I'm going to trigger Rich. I know we're going on that one. We'll come back to that. Heckles down. Business investment, and that is something that all of us in SMEs can relate to. How much do we speculatively invest in things with the intention of it producing some sort of return, making us better? And then the other one that I think we'll talk a bit more about than the others is R&D. R&D and innovation, combine those together.
Yeah.
And there's there's a tale of all sorts of other stuff, aging populations and things like that. But they're probably the 4 that most impact us or that we see the most.
Yeah.
So should we pick each of those
up? With skills. So when we're talking about skills, we're talking about training, expertise in the workforce.
Yeah. Yes, we did a bit of recruitment support, didn't we? And we know exactly what it's like from that whole cycle. We talked about the Aspire cycle. So even attracting the right candidates and the right skills and selecting them and so on. So nowadays, it's really hard when you're putting an advert out for a job to get a good number of candidates. The workforce has shrunk hugely compared to, say, 10 years ago.
Well, and that's, again, to refer back to Roger's reports, I think it was nearly 500,000-600,000 people retired early from COVID, post-COVID,
and haven't come
back into the workforce.
And of course, the government are trying to counter that now, and there are a few measures in the budget. I'm not sure if they're going to work, especially that rather puzzling one about increasing the lifetime limit on pensions, designed to get the doctors to come back, but now surely it'll encourage everybody else to retire earlier, because you can reach your retirement fund quicker if you earn enough.
And then there's 1.8 million fewer 18 to 25-year-olds.
Yes, the missing generation. This is really a puzzling one because my children were born in this period that it talks about, sort of late 90s, early noughties. The birth rate just plummeted, not just a bit off, but like you said, there's, 1.8 million fewer people in that age bracket. Well, each 10-year bracket in the UK has probably got about 10 million people in it. So 1.8 million, that's like a fifth of the what should have been there. It wasn't, just because the birth rate was low. And no one's worked it out.
The early 2000s then, is it?
Late 90s, early 2000s, yeah.
What's that? Millennium bug?
Go back to 25 years. Well, that was something Roger mentioned, wasn't it? I'm sure I buy into that. But he said maybe all the angst about the change of the millennium stopped people wanting to have kids. I don't know. Maybe it was possibly a more plausible argument is that if the economy is doing reasonably well, and you're growing up the career ladder and you've not been made redundant and you're getting pay rises every year, there's more of an incentive to stay working, especially for mums or mums to be, women who have decided not to have kids yet. So maybe that had an impact and then it goes back to normal in more normal times. I don't know. But whatever's happened, we haven't got enough 18 to 25-year-olds now. And then some of that would have been made up by EU workers, which, of course, is now a lot harder to get into the UK. We found this even trying to recruit a 50-something employee from France with exactly all the right skills. It's been difficult, post-Brexit. So all sorts of reasons why, but the skills available when you try to recruit aren't there like they used to be.
And how much, without wanting to get into the weeds too much on this, but you do quite a lot of work with schools, don't you, around education and getting them skills for careers and things. Anything on that you think?
I suppose I've got a few strong views on this, and I can't back them all up. But I do see that teachers are ridiculously overworked. They are constantly in fear of the next Ofsted inspection, which for a long time they were being given a bit of a buy. If you've got a good Ofsted inspection, you could live year to year knowing you weren't getting another one. And of course, Ofsted have been in the news a lot recently after that very sad story about the head teacher committing suicide after a report. But it just goes to show the pressure that teachers have got, and therefore what they are doing all the time is just get kids through the exams. And my work, as you say, through schools that I try to do, is to counter that as much as I can in my one-man way and say, yes, it's okay, it's important to get your exams, but there's a load of life skills, work skills that you're going to need to learn, which the schools just don't have time to develop. Proper team working skills, or arguing and debating and persuasive writing, maybe, or using a spreadsheet. Yeah. Right. And then even the skills that you tend to learn when you get into the workplace, just how to network, how to dress and shake hands properly and make eye contact, all that sort of stuff. So I'm not sure. Maybe every generation thinks that the country's going to the dogs and it's worse than it was when they were young, but it does seem to be now that the school system is so pressurized on getting exam results and missing out on these other things. I don't know.
And it would be interesting. I mean, we did have a couple of, I was thinking back at some of the futurist type people that we had come and speak. We used to run a networking event that we had people come speak, and we had a few futurists come, and it was about, what are the jobs of the future and what are the skills that would be required for those. And my kids are probably 10 or so years younger than yours, and they will just talk about, well, I'll just use ChatGPT to do it type of thing. And I don't let them on it. They know about it, but because that's a slippery slope, right? If at 10 years old you're using ChatGPT to do your maths homework, well, you may or you may not have a problem later on. Who knows how it's all. But
I sort of check myself on that opinion a bit, because I would agree we can't let that run amok, because the exam system hasn't caught up yet with the fact that it exists. But when handheld calculators became available, surely kids were using those at home in a way, whereas before they would have to take their slide rule into school. Yeah. I had a slide rule when I was at school.
I don't even know what that is.
You don't even know what that is? Wow. It's a calculator made out of a piece of wood.
Excellent.
I'll have to bring my slide rule in. I'm sure of that. Anyway, so that, that's happened, and then Google happened, and you can look stuff up, Maybe in 10 years' time we'll look back and laugh at the fact that, gosh, they were even trying to stop kids using ChatGPT, Now it's a part of, we don't expect people to walk around with log tables in their pocket anymore. We've found better ways of doing stuff. Yeah. So the whole skills problem, now we're not saying that the UK is that much worse than other countries, but I do remember McKinsey did a study on the effectiveness of the education systems across a whole range of countries. Because some countries are famous for being very good systems. Singapore, for example, some of the Scandinavian countries and so on. And then they compared it to the whole scale of those from good to less good. And you'd expect things like class sizes or length of school day or what exam systems to all have an impact. And it turned out that they were all quite low in impact. And the biggest single predictor of whether an education system was as good or not as other countries was the caliber of the teachers you attracted into the profession.
Right.
Which you could measure in part by salary of teachers. But if you imagine in your class at school, there were always some bright kids and some less bright kids. Surely you'd want the bright kids to go and teach the next generation, because you'd leverage their abilities, wouldn't you? But instead, of course, we let them go off into the finance sector or something, and then maybe people who have a calling for teaching go into it, rather than necessarily maybe the better ability at the subject aren't very good teachers. I don't know, but we don't tend to attract those into teaching.
Yeah, I seem to. Be careful what I say here, but I think there are teachers. I know teachers who are absolutely passionate, and they're almost like educators. It's the passion to educate the kids. And I think there's a culture. I think particularly when I finished my degree, it was almost like, right, if you can't get a job, then we'll pay off some of your student loan and give you a teacher training, course, PGC or whatever it was. And I think that's almost the wrong behavior there, because you're almost getting the people that can't get the jobs to say, well, if you can't get a job, just come and be a teacher, which seems a little bit, I don't know.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of that incentive.
It's always, I've always thought about that and thought, well, I'm not sure. Are you attracting the best there in terms of, and maybe it's a needs must. I know there's huge shortages of teachers, isn't there? And frankly, look at, all the issues that, we're almost funneling so many of our social ills into a school and expecting the teachers, in many cases, to have to deal with everything.
If the parents aren't supportive, and there's all sorts of multifaceted things. But there's a stat I heard the other day, I can't remember the exact number, but the percentage of maths teachers that haven't got a maths degree is higher than you'd like to think. You'd like to think that people teaching a specialist subject at least had studied it to a higher level themselves. But they just haven't got the choice, haven't got enough teachers. Back to our skills shortage problem again. So we've got a really long-term, multi-generational problem on skills. And I can't help thinking there's a bit of an attitude-y problem as well around celebrity culture. Some, not all kids, but some kids might think that you don't have to do really well at school to be successful these days.
Yeah, you do. They start young with the TikTok and Instagram influencer wannabe.
Just an interesting stat, and this is a bit of an aside, but I read a study the other day that they did in Sweden with conscripts after the war, from the sort of 1950s through to 70s and 80s, because they kept conscription going for much longer, and one of the requirements for being called up was to do an IQ test. They had a huge amount of data over decades of mainly men who'd been conscripted and their IQ at the age of 18, and then they're able to look at what did they do in life by the time they were 50 or 60, because they had data going for so long. And they attempted to correlate or see if there was a correlation between the IQ of an 18-year-old and what ended up with them in life. Now, it turns out that the curve, if you draw one, is in two very distinct parts, and that there's an almost linear relationship between IQ and financial success up to a moderate level. Let's say roughly 1.5 to twice the average salary. So in the UK, that'd be about, say, 50k salary. So to get to a salary up to about 50k, there's a reasonably straight line relationship between IQ at 18 and whether you get there. Beyond it, the relationship almost disappears. It doesn't soften, it just disappears. So to become more successful than that, your 100 grand plus type salaries, it almost doesn't matter what your IQ was at 18. It's more down to personality and luck and grit and gumption and maybe network and whatever else. So anyway, there you go. We're probably...
Well, another interesting aside on the IQ thing. So the American Army also did the same thing. So you have to have an IQ of above 85 to be able to join the American Army. Now, that's, respectfully quite low.
Well, if 100 is the average, by definition.
So it's, you think that... So you can't have an IQ of below 85 to join the army, but apparently something like 15% of the population in the US, and I guess this probably maps roughly over across to other countries, other 15% of the US population has an IQ of under 85. So you think, what jobs do those people, what skills do those people kind of do? So it's quite an interesting conversation, isn't it? Around, well, what kind of economy, what skills do we need in the economy, particularly as we talk more about automation, digitalization, all of that type of thing.
Well, that's where schools have got to adapt over long-term times, because there would have been a point where it didn't matter what your IQ was if all you're going to do is work in the field or then latterly go down a mine. Whereas now we've got much more knowledge workers. There's still the place for people with a different level of IQ have got talents in other areas, and they might be incredibly dexterous or very good at problem solving or pattern recognition. There's lots of very clever people but wouldn't get picked up in an IQ sense of clever, and we need them in other ways. But as we become less manual and able to use things like dexterity or
there's
speed.
a McDonald's that's just opened in the States that doesn't have anybody working in it. You literally use an app to get the phone and there's some robots doing something crazy, flipping the burgers. Bit like the Amazon shops as well, isn't it?
Where, so one of those in London the other day.
So increasingly we're kind of... I don't know.
So before we drown our sorrows even further in our Guinness Zero, we'll have to get some of the proper stuff. We'll move on from skills, but needless to say, there's a skills problem. We'll come back to what we think we might be able to do on some of that stuff in a minute. So apart from skills, the next thing I mentioned was infrastructure. Now we could, I know this is a trigger, we could moan all day long about the lack of suitable infrastructure for doing business and even for just existing as a person, hospitals and stuff. There's probably hee-haw we can do about it as individual citizens and business owners, unless you're going to get into government. Make some different decisions. And even then, I'm not pretending the decisions are easy to make. It's zero-sum game, isn't it?
Just the fact, I'm going to have to go straight into it. The fact you cannot even make a phone call in this country on a major motorway network without it breaking up multiple times.
Must stress you're talking hands-free phone call.
Absolutely.
Perfectly legal,
It's just crazy. It's just absolutely crazy.
But we both drive around a bit, don't we? And we tend to catch up with each other when we're on journeys between meetings, and the amount of times our calls drop. And we know where all those places are.
So they must know where people are. You can almost triangulate where, right, okay.
Oh, so you just come off the M6 onto the M54. Oh, no, you've just gone down that.
It could always be a maths question, couldn't it? For back to the skills thing.
Yeah.
Rich is travelling at 55 miles an hour.
And his phone cuts out.
And Dave's travelling at this. Where are they when they both lose signal?
So you're right. That traffic jams, trains, our ability to move around and do stuff. The amount of time we waste sat in cars or not able to work on trains or whatever. So infrastructure, big problem. Broadband, even in our office. Forget about traveling around. We're not too bad here actually. We get about 80 meg signal, but there's a lot of us in here. You could do with more.
Yeah.
But one of our team, Lewis, the other day was saying that the plan to dig up the town centre and put the fibre in has just been shelved because the logistics are too difficult. Too many old grade listed buildings, whatever. So there you go. So that's definitely something holding back the UK infrastructure. Now, business investment. The last two are really much more up our street in terms of what SMEs are. We've talked about skills, but business investment and then innovation and R&D. What do we know about our clients' attitudes and businesses' attitudes to investing?
I mean, I don't know how much this follows on from in terms of the kind of the attitude around the infrastructure piece, where I think if you see a lack of investment in infrastructure, even in your drive to work, if you're driving to work and you can't make a phone call and you potholes everywhere and all this stuff, and then you get into work, you're not exactly in a frame of mind that says, hey, let's take some risks, let's invest, let's build something for the future. And I do think there's almost a bit of a national psyche maybe.
Well, if the government took a lead, you mean, we'd all more likely to follow. Be a bit braver with some things. I mean, think how long it takes to get more confidence
as well, wouldn't you? In terms of thinking, well, this is what we're trying to go for here. We're going to have some great infrastructure so that we can build a business and we can move around the country without it.
I think certainly if you've got governments changing quite frequently, and even if they're not changing colour, but the ministers are changing and then the policies are changing, you never know from 1 minute whether the capital allowances are going to suddenly go up or down because they've just changed those again, haven't they, last lot, or whether you're going to get some chancellor coming in. Corporation tax in the UK has just gone up from 19% to 25%. Okay, they pre-announced it, but all of these big changes, you can't plan for 5 years ahead on this sort of stuff. Interest rates, you don't. They are, pretty predictable this year now, I suppose. But a year ago, you didn't know whether they're going to go up to nearly 5% or not, which is what they're doing.
I suppose an interesting one is around electric vehicles. So a lot of businesses are moving that way. And what impact does that have? So a friend of mine, he's traveling around a lot around the country, probably does, I would imagine, 25, 30,000 miles a year all over the place. And his business has just gone to electric vehicle fleet, but not sort of a Tesla or something like that where you've got the range. I can't quite remember what it is, but you think, well, what impact does then that have on the productivity of a business where, okay, for a particular reason, sustainability or eco credentials or whatever it is, that you're going for electric vehicle now, but if that means that people have got to, can't just get around the country quite in the same way that they were before.
Isn't it funny how we're more likely to invest, if that's the right word, in something like that? It's a very tangible asset. You can see it, and employees benefit from having it. But that's not an investment that makes somebody more productive, is it? It might make them happier because they've got a newer car and maybe they want an electric car. It might make them worse, as you say. If the range isn't there, you may have to allow a lot longer to get somewhere to your client meeting or whatever than you would before. But companies are more likely, I see it myself, more likely to invest in electric car fleet, probably from their environmental credentials.
Tax break, isn't it, as well?
And yet if you ask them to buy everybody a new laptop every 4 years or 3 years because their old one's slowing down, or make sure everyone's got the latest smartphone because of what you can do with them these days, let alone buying the next machine on the shop floor that runs at 50% faster rate than the old one. Why wouldn't you do that? And yet you would go and increase the fleet, and sometimes don't do either.
Yeah.
So I do see that as a real mental block, I think, that a lot of people have got. Now, maybe some companies can't afford to invest. So is there an argument there about, are we propping up zombie companies? Another one of Roger Martin-Fagg's famous.
Yeah, that was a big part of his...
he's keen on that.
When he came to speak to us in November, which is a few months ago now, but his whole piece around zombie businesses was quite interesting.
Well, he was convinced that companies were going to be going out of business a lot faster than I think has transpired so far, but it could still be happening. The banks haven't pulled the rug yet. But we know that companies that tick along, maybe lifestyle businesses where the owners don't want to invest, they just want to carry on taking the money out and going on nice holidays. They're not interested in improving their productivity, or they can't do it because they can't afford it, and they would have gone out of business, but they're being propped up. And then there's just a kind of a risk appetite thing. A lot of people, I think, here have got. We're probably, like you said earlier, about following the government's lead. You're probably a bit like your neighbor, other business people. If they're being risky, maybe you're more likely to be risky as well.
We don't have that culture, do we? Like they do in America around business risk, and almost they see failure as a step to success, whereas here, if you sort of went bankrupt, that's almost like, okay, well, that's it. Whereas in the States, it's almost like that's expected if you're going to be successful.
Not quite a badge of honor, but a badge of experience.
And it's like, well, you kind of make an omelette, break some eggs type of thing.
And I think you're right. There's a stigma to a business failure here, even though it was, well, at least they gave it a go. There's not. And even to that new business, in Britain, you see a lot of established in 1850 type signs above businesses to make a virtue of how long they've been around. Whereas you get the impression that in countries like the US, a new business would be given more credit. Whereas here it maybe would be a bit more,
Well, I just remember someone saying to me, in the States, if you see, someone had a Ferrari or whatever, sports car, the kids around that will be looking at it almost in an aspirational way. Whereas in the UK, they'll be keying it or something.
Keyed outside.
Which, is not probably quite true. It's a bit of generalization.
I think we need to rename this podcast The Grumpy Old Men. SME
Group. Well, I grew up with a lot of Americans. So I have that in my formative years, I grew up with a lot of Americans. So that has probably shaped my outlook on life quite significantly.
I can imagine it would, yeah.
So I see that as that American way of business is probably a bit.
And I can't help thinking, just as a thought experiment, if we took people we know or indeed ourselves and dropped us into a Silicon Valley type thing, and I'm not putting Silicon Valley on a pedestal, I'm sure there's, and as we were talking earlier, there's a bit of a move away from California now, isn't there, a little bit in terms of into other parts of the US. But even so, if you took UK talent and put it into that environment, you can never do the experiment, but how different would people turn out to be? Would talented people in the UK that stay here end up being risk averse, and would the same people but in an environment like that be more risk taking? And we talk, funding is more available.
How long you'd have to be in the environment for that to, by osmosis, you pick up either this is the way we do things. But either way, isn't it?
Well, I think even back to our evolution as a company here, when we've applied for grants in the past, all the grant awarding body is worried about is how many jobs are you going to create from the grant. And over recent years especially, I've been complaining about that method. When we're at full employment with a skills shortage, why do you want me to create more vacancies? We've got 1.1 million vacancies we can't fill already. Why don't you reward me instead for investing in something that increases productivity? Because the country's got a productivity problem, not an unemployment problem. And yet our policy is stuck in the 1970s. They just want me to create more vacancies that I can't fill. So if even our grant system is like that, the banks have got an attitude as well. They're very risk averse. I'll lend you your money if you can prove to me that you don't need it. But if you need it, then I'm afraid you're going to have to mortgage your house. And I'm sure that's different in other more aggressive growing countries. So there's probably all sorts of reasons around that. But I'm sure the political uncertainty we went through last autumn with sort of crazy change of chancellors every couple of days, the Kwarteng budget and all that sort of thing. So goodness knows what sort of impact all that sort of has. So anyway, that's business investment. It's interesting to note, by the way, that was going up reasonably steadily up to about 2016. And if you look at the graph on that, and it's in Roger's report, if you download it and look at it, it is actually flat, perfectly flat, apart from around COVID, where it goes obviously hugely negative. But all it is bounce back up again to the flat line that it was before. You couldn't draw almost more of a cartoon style graph to say things were going okay, and now they're going really badly. It's almost too
happened in 2016?
Don't go there. We know what happened in 2016. Now, I'm not sure if we can draw all lines back to that. Is it coincidental? It certainly changed attitudes. It polarized society. Let's not go. We could have a podcast about
anything that creates that level of uncertainty, isn't it? That's what businesses crave, certainty. And
Well, even people who tried to invest, and I remember this when Brexit finally came into being in 2020, was it? Or was that the transition period or whatever? But lead times for things were going up to almost a year if you wanted to buy a new machine or something. Yeah. And now, of course, we've got the chip shortage, so then buying computers was hard. So it's become harder to invest, even if you want to. That's assuming you can borrow the money and you want to do it.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing we want to touch on that impacts productivity very much in an SME is innovation and R&D. Yeah. Now, this doesn't have to cost a lot of money. Okay, R&D might.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to, does it?
No. And I think, again, this is another area where, bringing it back to sort of Roger's reports and Roger's thoughts on these is that SMEs can actually have a real impact here, because the agility and the ability to make decisions quickly that is within the kind of the remit of an SME, maybe compared to a larger company.
Well, you can do it on the day. You can do it there and then.
On the day. If, the ability to leverage a lot more different, say, SaaS products, build your business processes around it. I
really pity those people we work with daily in some of our clients where they've got IT departments, and I understand why. But the fact that when we've got a problem, we can just search on the internet, find the plugin that we need, install it, and we're off and running again. Yeah. And within 5 minutes of having a problem, we've solved it. That would take either forever or a long time to get approved, to get somebody to be allowed to install something different.
Yeah.
It's just crazy. When you think about things like Otter that we just use all the time to do transcripts of things, or ChatGPT, we've talked about getting it to solve problems. I'll do some data cleansing work for a client the other day, and the data was a bit messy, and there's a fuzzy lookup plugin for Excel. It's brilliant. You just plug it in and it'll come up with, use your VLOOKUP thing like in the past, but instead of being an exact match, it says it's close enough. That's a 70% probability of being a match. Fantastic. It's a free plugin. But I know that several of our clients wouldn't allow you to use that because you've been installing software.
And I think in a way as well, that does impact on how people think, back on some of those other areas. So, my wife works for the council, within the council, and it's, archaic in some ways, the IT and all that. But there's that attitude then of, that's the system. That's just the old,
that's
system.
A good point. Does it just browbeat you into accepting a low innovation?
Yeah.
So if the culture around you is low innovation, why would you fight against that and try and break all the rules if it's just going to cause you a heartache?
Well, and it's designed so that you don't. So, I go in and say, well, look, what if you, why wouldn't you use this piece of software or this? Oh, well, IT says you can't, then you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that and the other. You think, well, I don't know, there's quite a large percentage of people that are employed in public sector in this country.
Yeah.
And again, if that's kind of the, a representative of the whole.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, the size of the state is about 40% of the UK. That's not all employees, that's services provided as well. But you're right, they're interesting.
It's more than China, actually, as a percentage.
As a percentage, well.
But I think it's almost, if you're not, and I'd say this controversially, but I think I probably save on average about an hour a day using things like ChatGPT at the moment. And I think increasingly that's going to, not just for work things, but give me a recipe for this evening or something, or whatever it is that you're going to spend looking up time doing.
Yeah.
Things like that. People and businesses that are going to take on that type of innovation are going to be the ones that end up with the productivity gains and the competitive advantage.
And you try it. I mean, I got ChatGPT to answer a reasonably long email for me the other day, and it came up a fantastic result in 20 seconds. And we talked, I know this episode isn't really about HubSpot and our marketing work, but we do a lot of automation within HubSpot around our marketing. So, lots of things happen while we're sleeping. If somebody goes onto our website or applies for a job or downloads something, then things are triggered.
Someone the other day, I think I probably saved between 50 and 70 hours on our last recruitment round just by automating all the processes involved. Yeah. And that took me probably about 200 hours to do. No, it didn't take me anywhere close to that. But yeah, that's where that innovation attitude probably needs to,
And okay, so we've talked there a lot about innovation. Now R&D, I think R&D's got a really weird relationship with small businesses in the UK as a result of the R&D tax rebate that's been around since the early 2000s. I think Peter Mandelson introduced it.
Yeah.
But it's made everybody think that R&D is that thing that you can claim R&D tax rebate on, and that's not R&D in that sense, is it? They've almost
I was always a bit of a purist of it. I suppose having a science background and kind of being doing research, proper research. Some of the things that you would see that would pass as R&D. Yeah, I think, well, that's not really R&D.
Well, maybe thankfully, but I know that HMRC are tightening up on some of the more frivolous claims, like inventing a new cocktail being eligible for R&D expenses. Yeah. But I don't think we've got still the right culture again on investing in companies prepared to take a risk. So, we talked before about our minute-taking software that we developed, Magic Minutes. Don't mind telling our audience that that's cost us well north of a couple £100,000, maybe £250,000 over a long period of time, including employees and so on, to develop it. But that's a reasonably big investment. But even we decided we were going to do that out of retained earnings rather than borrowing the money for it. And certainly we couldn't find anybody, albeit on a cursory search, who was going to come in and pile in £500,000 to let us do it properly. So you've almost got to prove that you don't need the money first, and then you're going to attract the investors. Yeah. So there you go. That's innovation R&D. So we've covered the sort of four main areas as we see them that hold back productivity that SMEs experience. The skills bit, we see that through our recruitment and retention, the infrastructure, business investment, and then innovation and R&D. There's loads of other stuff, as I said in the opening, which also is implied. The aging population, and all Western economies are suffering from this, the lower birth rates and all that sort of thing.
So yeah, apparently it's the decade I was saying earlier, I was depressing everybody with apparently it's the decade where the Western economic model collapses this decade, according to the chap called Peter Zeihan. It's worth looking up on YouTube, and he's a geopolitical strategist. And he talks a lot about this, just how this was always going to be the decade where the economic model had issues, just because of population.
Well, so many things happening at once then, with population having gone over the hill and going down again in Western economies. All of this AI coming about, this change of attitude post-pandemic about work and hours of work. Who knows what's going to happen? So just to close, as an SME, either owner or someone who works in an SME, what can we do about it? Well, from the national infrastructure bit, hee-haw, really. We can't go and build roads and hospitals and broadband, can we? So you can try and find tech to get around the problem. We've got a 5G dongle that's 10 times faster than anything we can get by digging up the pavement. So you find ways around it doing that sort of thing, don't you? But apart from that, you can't do much about infrastructure. Skills, I think this is one area that we can all collectively do an awful lot about. And it's not about blaming the education system. It's taking what the education system outputs and then accepting that you may have to recruit people that aren't there yet, and either using the apprenticeship scheme or just in-house training of any sort, develop your own people and then keep them. You've got to look after your people well so that they stay. There's a huge cost of people turning up, just the inductions, the training, and introducing to clients, then if they leave again. Yeah. So that's around skills. We can definitely do a lot about that.
Investing in automation is another big thing. I think that will become increasingly important over the next
and encouraging innovation generally. Whether it be processes in a more industrial sense, or a lot more people work in offices than do in factories. What about all the automation in an office? How many people do you watch over the shoulder and see them struggling with a spreadsheet or how to do something in Microsoft Word, or even using rules in Outlook, basic stuff about sending emails? People are still struggling with doing that sort of stuff.
I was talking to someone the other day who had a test for an interview that was doing mail merge.
That's the test, you do mail merge. And we still know clients where they have typists. Yeah. Amazingly. 2023. And then I think it's about risk. Educate yourself about what risk you really are facing if you take some brave decisions. And bear in mind to be honest about the potential reward. Nothing is risk-free. Yeah. And nothing is necessarily free to do, but we're only going to grow that way if we can invest in it.
And I think that's a mindset thing, particularly for this country. We're naturally cynical. Or at least apparently I am.
I think all grumpy old men are.
At the same time, I do think there is we've got to embrace for any dent in productivity nationally, there has to be a cultural embrace of it's okay to fail. Yeah. So long as it's not, so long as there's a longer term goal in sight. Yeah. then...
Well, we've talked quite openly before about failing our way to success.
Yeah.
We talked in the Phil Caudle podcast last week, which has been phenomenally well received a couple of weeks ago now, wasn't it? And the fact that we've done the same. We've created businesses that haven't succeeded, but we're quite open about it.
Yeah.
You know, we're not trying to put ourselves up there saying that everything we do touches to gold. We try lots of different things. We experiment, and sometimes it works, which is great, and we get the rewards from that.
Yeah.
But sometimes it doesn't, and you got to try different stuff.
Absolutely.
There we go. So, as you promised half an hour ago, we've just solved the productivity puzzle. And we had a very nice,
it was actually
nice glass of Guinness Zero while we're at it. I look forward to next week so we can start working through the row of other beers we have available.
Citrus and floral aromas, I can see.
Have you seen that one made with mushrooms at the end?
Is it?
So it looks a bit dodgy. I'm not so sure. I'm looking forward to that one as much.
The Functional Brew Company.
Yeah, did you get it? Yeah. So there we go. That's another episode of the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow. Thank you very much for listening or watching. And please, as I ask every week, do share and follow our podcast on whichever platform you get your podcast from. But more importantly, tell your friends, send them an email with a link, or just chat about it in the pub, and tell them that it's sometimes useful to listen to. Might trigger a few debates. But in the meantime, good luck with your business.